so interesting how that history is sort of cycled. And now the very things that we defend as wholesome and religious and belonging to the tradition of Christmas were met with skepticism by our ancestors in the faith. Our fathers and mothers in the faith looked at those things very suspiciously.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Pastor Talk podcast. We are taking a short reprieve from our other sort of series and the things that we had been doing, and we're going to take a few weeks here looking at Advent/Christmas themes, and we're doing it with an interesting frame, which is really a natural frame, if we're going to be honest. Clint and I have very different sort of perspectives on Christmas. I don't think substantially different views of Christmas itself, but we definitely get to it from different roads. And we're going to reflect a little bit over the next couple of weeks on what we can learn about this really kind of messy, entangled, in some ways beautiful, in some ways really complicated story that is Christmas and our observance of it in the midst of a culture that has very much made it its own cultural thing at the same time where Christians have our own unique practices and understandings of what is happening in this day. So we turn our attention today specifically on some of the background of this. We're going to look a little bit at how we get to our understanding of Christmas today. It may be more complicated and nuanced than you might initially think. And that is going to set for us a larger sort of stage or platform that the rest of our conversations can be built. Because in order to talk about some of the fun stuff of Christmas, which is coming, I talk a little bit about the music, the traditions, some of the things that it's easy to sort of point ourselves in the direction of, is this good or helpful or is it not? Those conversations are very much dependent upon the fact that we all have a shared understanding of how we get to this kind of entanglement that we have today. So we're glad to have you with us, and we'll jump right into it.
I think what is really interesting, Michael, is the extent to which Christmas is clouded. It has a pretty checkered history in many ways. Some people are surprised at the amount of diversity, variety, and conflict. You know, every year we fight about something that has to do with Christmas, whether it's the Starbucks cups or whether it's X in Xmas or whether it's some change to something traditional, a song that is or isn't okay. But I think maybe people would be surprised to know that that's been going on for a long time. Christmas has a rich, wonderful history of celebration, but right alongside it, there have always been questions about what is and isn't appropriate. Interestingly enough, even Christmas itself was one time questioned as whether it was something that fit into a life of faith. And I think that's surprising for people. It starts right away in the very earliest instances as people began to think that there should be a moment where we celebrated the birth of Christ. Interestingly enough, that itself caused some conflict. Nobody had a good sense of when Jesus was born. There wasn't a clear indication that they had a particular day or season in mind. And so even choosing the date for Christmas, which is not something we think of, but this caused its own unhappiness for people. And one of the first Christmas fights probably was not only whether or not to have it, but when to have it.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite sort of conversation starters that happens occasionally. A person will come in and they'll kind of look at you like, I've got a ace up my sleeve. And they'll say, hey, Pastor, did you know, love that lead in, did you know that Christmas was actually a pagan holiday? Like they just swore in that moment. Did you know? Well, yeah, actually, we did know. And Christmas extends way, way beyond what we think of as December 25th with all of the inherited kind of traditions of that day and even the biblical witness that we've associated with that day. What we see is historically there is a really a very ancient kind of celebration that happens in this time of year. In the middle of December, you've got the moment of the evening with the least amount of daylight. You've got this very hard season that is going to lead into a gradually increasing march towards spring. Some things that we don't even think of, things like lots of farmers and herders aren't going to keep their flocks all through the winter. So this is a natural season where they are going to cull those herds. They're going to have fresh meat for the first time, maybe the entire season. It's also the time when wine is fermenting, and so there's drink available. So this becomes a natural moment in the ancient world for many different kinds of celebrations. Different places do it in different ways, and you can pull out the history of that if that's of interest to you. But the point being, this is a sort of a larger fertile ground. This time of year is for different kinds of celebrations throughout history for lots of different reasons. And so, as the church continues to gain in its influence in the 2nd century, there begins to be a reckoning with what Christians do with this season, as it grows in influence in the Roman Empire, and therefore Christianity is now having impacts in different places with different traditions in this season. That's when the church begins to take very seriously this idea of a Christmas celebration. But up until that point, Easter was the central holiday of Christian faith and practice. That is the day when Jesus Christ is resurrected, and that is the day that we see clearly emphasized in scriptures. Even the sermon that Peter gives in the book of Acts is very much emphasizing that moment. It's then later, once again, 2nd century, as the Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire, now it needs to begin to interface with this larger Christmas, December season, and we start to have this attention paid to the 25th.
Yeah, and it's really several centuries before it lands consistently on December 25th. A lot of diversity in terms of when Christmas is celebrated. Also, alongside that, a lot of questions remained about should Christians even celebrate December 25th, the birth of Christ. Did that matter? That's not scripturally, it's not very important in the sense of the scriptures don't make a big deal of it. It's not all in all the Gospels, such as Easter and Good Friday and those other places. So initially, there are people of faith arguing that Christmas shouldn't be celebrated. And as it gains traction, even then it becomes a kind of alternative to some of the other things that were happening on that winter solstice. And some of that carried over. There were some pretty raucous celebrations of Christmas. There were some moments where, as it is now, Christmas blended pretty quickly into the celebration of a new year, and things that Christians typically were expected not to participate in, they may have jumped in with both feet when it came to that week after Christmas, or even some cases Christmas itself. So Christmas is not something that was simply fixed in stone at the beginning of the church's life and that we've protected it and that we've been committed to it. It has really ebbed and flowed. For the first 1,000 years almost of the church's life, a lot of ambiguity about Christmas, both when it was, what it was, how it should be celebrated, if it should be celebrated. Very ironic now, Michael, that we argue about whether places respect Christmas enough when our original journey began with really the question, should we even have it?
Yeah, it's a great cosmic twist, and those are some of the most interesting turns in history when we see how the pendulum can shift in these substantial ways. I think a thing that needs said early on in this conversation is the people who believe that the Christian appropriation of holidays somehow undoes everything that surrounds it have a fundamental misread, I think, of the celebration, but also, if I'm going to be honest, history. Because Christians have been doing this kind of thing for a long time. What makes Christmas different is the absolute scale. I mean, Christmas is like any other kind of religious holiday, except on steroids to the 20,000th degree. I'm making up words and I can't even say them. The reality is that Christmas has just gone so massive and has such a large commercial and cultural and then, of course, even religious impact that it is at another level. But the reality is the church has always been comfortable with some level of baptizing pagan things, to come into community and say, well, you were celebrating this, but now we recognize that in light of the revelation of Jesus Christ, you shouldn't celebrate that anymore. You should celebrate this instead. And you can point to many different holidays, a lot of those very culturally based, different regions and people, different languages. And the church has been comfortable with that kind of appropriation. Now, one has always had an argument regarding how much of that is appropriate and how much needs to be done for a practice or a celebration to be fully Christian and no longer somehow beholden to the original practices that may have inspired it. Those conversations have been had literally for hundreds and thousands of years. And so we're not going to in some way push that needle into a completely different direction. The point, though, being is that in order to take our understanding of Christmas today seriously, we need to be willing to accept that it is not in some way a nugget that has been carried throughout all time in history. That's just simply an overly simplistic and to be honest, an ahistorical understanding of what Christmas actually is. To understand it in its fullness, we need to understand that it has had a lot of different synchronicities from cultures and times, as well as theologians and Christians who have had substantial disagreements about what should be in the fold of the Christmas celebration. And Clint began a sermon series that we were doing here at First Pres yesterday, in which you mentioned, Clint, this idea that Christmas has built into it a kind of small source material. I mean, realistically, the Gospels don't say a lot about Christmas, and we often as Christians, especially on this version of our Christmas celebration, this moment in history as we celebrate Christmas with all of its complexities, we sometimes read into the Bible what it actually says. But in reality, the text is small. 2 books, very small sections that tell us about the birth of Christ. And in many ways, Christmas has become the largest religious celebration in the Christian church. And that kind of dichotomy is going to create some really interesting places, some hooks for conversation and even historically disagreement.
I think it probably is difficult for us, Michael, because we have so many things that are so deeply entrenched into how we do Christmas. We have trees, we have lights, we have music, we have gifts, we have Santa Claus. But what isn't, I think, important to understand, but sometimes hard to remember, is that nearly everything that Christians got in regard to Christmas, we got from somewhere else. So there were other groups using trees, and Christians decided we'll make that part of our celebration. The idea of decorating, we didn't come up with that. The idea of gift giving, it grows out of other traditions. So the Christians that first celebrated Christmas borrowed from what they saw around them, and they essentially said, we're going to do a similar practice, but we're going to try and make it a referent of Jesus. We're going to try and make it about this celebration of Jesus Christ coming to the world. But those things don't begin as Christian practices. And each and every time we embraced one, there was some argument about whether it belonged, about whether it was okay, because, say, the origins of it were not some place, not some group that Christians wanted to be associated with. And so there's this constant ebb and flow in the history of Christmas. And that continues. There are Christians who celebrate Christmas who won't have anything to do with Santa Claus because they believe that's outside of the faith story. There are others that will appeal to the idea of St. Nicholas and say, no, that Christians came up with that. The truth is always a little of both, a little messier than simply cut and dry. The phrase Merry Christmas itself is, a misnomer of some sorts, because Christmas was a reference to a worship service, the Christ Mass, not the idea of a special day. And so we just have to understand a little bit about where we come from, because in our own day, we continue to have to make decisions about what does and doesn't belong to Christmas, about what is the religious aspect of Christmas that boosts our faith and that makes it self-important in our discipleship, and what are the cultural aspects of Christmas that may or may not be helpful and that we may need to view with some, I won't say, I'm tempted to say skepticism, but I'll just say some awareness, or at least some thoughtfulness about whether that does or doesn't point to Christ, which is the point of Christian Christmas.
So we're going to see this theme, I think, that we'll trace through several of our conversations. So we might as well be upfront with it right now. I think that what we're going to discover is that as people of faith, especially if you're compelled by or you're within the Reformed tradition, we tend to be people who emphasize thought, and we give a lot of emphasis upon theological consistency. Not that we've always done that perfectly, but it's a value that we have. The problem in bringing that frame without other frames to Christmas is that Christmas is, at this point, so much more than a consistent theology of worship to Jesus Christ. It is an emotion. I mean, Christmas is designed in many different ways. The lights, the songs, the traditions, the food, the smells, the gatherings, the things that we do. I mean, these are in many ways, and I don't mean this negatively, but they're constructed and they've been honed over time to leave us with a state of feeling. To give some evidence to this point, Clint, I think of the Christmas Eve service that we have here, that moment where the sanctuary slowly lights as candles light. Many people describe that experience as a metaphor of their experience of Christmas, that Christmas isn't truly Christmas without that song, that moment, that sort of prescience that happens. I point to that as an example to say that's how I think messy and convoluted and bound together Christmas is, because we feel in that moment a kind of sacredness. And yet in that moment, we're also experiencing far more than just theology. It's not just about the birth of Christ. It's also about the sense of community, the gathering of family, the traditions that will follow. There's so much that happens that's been baked into this moment that if we're going to be honest about it, we need to be willing to sort of unpack that. That said, I just want to add in here, I don't think that means we need to throw everything out. That this isn't a baby with the bathwater situation. To be thoughtful about Christmas and to admit that there's a lot of things happening here, I don't think keeps Christians from celebrating Christmas. I do think what it does, it asks us to submit Christmas to Christ, as opposed to just assuming that everything that we've done is somehow encapsulating of the perfect Christmas story. That's where Christians, I think, have made mistakes. We've begun to think that the traditions themselves somehow represent the only true celebration of Jesus Christ. And when we're willing to allow history and context to inform that, maybe even reimagine that, we become less possessive of this thing and more willing for it to change and to ebb as it always has. And hopefully towards the end, as those who celebrate Christ, towards the end of making Christ the center as opposed to whatever traditions we may have put there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And those who are a part of First Press aren't surprised by this. You are far more gracious to Christmas than I am. I am ambivalent at best most of the time in regard to Christmas. But I think the tension there is that Christmas, in many ways, in the place we live, has nothing to do with Christian Christmas. So much of what we understand to be Christmas has almost nothing inherently to do with Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean that faithful people can't do those things and keep Jesus at the center of it. But it is to say that what our culture hands us as Christmas is, I think, a very watered down and empty version of what the church tried to create when we carved out the idea of a celebration of the birth of Christ. And so little of what we have as Christmas really points to Jesus from a cultural sense. And yes, you can be angry about that. You can fight back. But the idea that Christians argue over things like whether a cup says Merry Christmas or Happy Holidays, or whether you write out Christmas or put an X in it, these are the most trivial matters in the bigger picture of whether or not our own Christmases point to Jesus, or whether we're simply embracing the culture around us that has taken what began as our thing and turned it into their own thing, largely to market it. And we live in this weird moment, I think, and it's not a new moment, but it is increasingly true, in which our thing really is no longer our thing. And what do you do with that? How do you find the genuine sense and truth of the celebration of Jesus Christ in this huge mess of Christmas stuff? Sorry if I just called your favorite Christmas thing a huge mess. But again, I lean a little bit that direction. But how do we keep our focus in the right place in light of so much that would point it in the wrong direction?
So I wouldn't call it maybe a mess. I think that maybe is a pejorative term. But I would say that as Christians, we are always balancing things that are held in tension. And what maybe makes Christmas hard is because for many of us, Christmas is a season of lightness, a season where we value a moment of giving up care and trying to value the things that matter. And so as it feels like Christmas is being shaped by cultural forces, the temptation is to circle the wagons and to say, this needs protected away from this. But a fundamental value of this conversation is that when you circle the wagons around Christmas, what you will almost inevitably miss is that what you're protecting is a thing that Christians have been suspect of and have been trying to hold lightly for a very, very long time, really since the beginning. Let me give you an example of this, okay? So think of the Puritans, right? The men and women that make their way out of England. They come to America very much for the purpose of establishing a pure, theologically consistent church. When they come to America, they institute a policy. In fact, they made it law in Boston that you cannot celebrate Christmas. And in fact, if the Puritans caught you celebrating Christmas, they would fine you 5 shillings for that infraction. That seems harsh to us, but the reason for it is they took very seriously, maybe can I say literally, but regardless, very seriously, the scriptural account of Jesus's birth. And they saw, and they were right in seeing, that December 25th is not named as the birthday of Christmas. And so for them, it was actually impinging upon the scriptural witness to make that the day, that we don't know when it is, and so therefore we shouldn't institute a day for that, but rather we should celebrate the coming of Christ all year round. That's the spirit behind what they were trying to say. If you're willing to see that this is a internal debate. The Puritans are doing so from within the frame of the Christian faith. Now, we might disagree theologically, but they are doing this as those who believe in Jesus Christ. What that has to tell us is that when we get worked up about coffee cups or the latest song that is or isn't in vogue during the Christmas season, or we find a place where retailers are somehow impinging upon the tradition that we have taken for granted in Christmas, the danger when we get upset about those things is that we actually lose our ability as Christians to be having these very constructive conversations about what does and doesn't help us celebrate the advent of Jesus Christ. And I use that word intentionally because one thing that the Christian faith has consistently brought to the conversation of Christmas is that Christmas is not just celebration. And this has been a thing, not to wax too long here, Clint, but this is a thing that's always really interested me about sort of modern Christian Christmas celebrations. Lots of churches have what they call a blue Christmas. And these are services that they often intend for people who are going through difficult seasons. They may have lost a loved one or have had a painful diagnosis. What's interesting to me about the blue Christmas kind of tradition is that seems to me to be adding a thing that Christians have always assumed with Advent. We've always believed that the road to Christmas is a difficult road. In fact, if you read the gospel narratives again, you're going to see that the story to Christmas is a very perilous story with social discord and with difficulty and pain. And that has always been a core part of the Christian understanding, that to get to Christmas is the suffering, the humility, the willingness of God to take on flesh, that this is part of what God's advent means. And so therefore it would fit into our celebrations. The problem is when we assume that Christmas is all celebration and not that journey towards God's coming, then we begin to miss the diversity and I would say even the strength of Christmas. So this isn't about getting rid of things that help us celebrate Christmas per se, I wouldn't say. I think it's rather to be able to look at those things from a frame that helps us see the fullness of Christmas, which when we circle the wagons around these other things, we often fail to see.
Yeah, I think it would be difficult to argue that one could follow the cultural pattern of Christmas and call it a faithful celebration of Christ. I think the path of faith and the path of culture are ultimately going to deliver you to some moments where decisions have to be made about what Christmas truly is. And it's not to say that the cultural emphasis of, generosity, togetherness, excess, it's not to say that they're bad in and of themselves, but it is to say that the world around us gets far more excited about Christmas than it does about Christ, and that can't be true for Christians. We have to fight against that to some extent. We have to keep our focus on the reason that we have Christmas, the thing in which we are theoretically celebrating to begin with, the idea that God came to us, that the incarnation of God is hope for all. Not the latest sale, not the lights, not the music, not the cookies, but that Jesus Christ stands at the center, and those other things serve him. Those other things point to him. And I don't think it would take a very critical eye, Michael, to look at the modern version of Christmas and ask some serious questions about whether that happens. Now, having said that, as much as Christmas sometimes bugs me, I don't think Christians should be out there fighting about Christmas. I don't think that's something worth our time. I don't think we should care what Walmart says to us when we go in the store, or what somebody puts on a coffee cup, or what Santa Claus looks like. These aren't things I think are very valuable places for Christians to dig in and be stubborn. And a lot of times Christians don't understand what they're doing. The historic pushback still get asked once in a while, though I think it's less common now, the idea of Xmas, and that this whole line about trying to take Christ out of Christmas by putting an X there. I think what people don't understand is that what looks like X to us is in Greek the first letter of Christ. Christians came up with Xmas. It was an abbreviation that was used and it meant the X, what looks like the X, was a symbol for Christ. Right. And 1,000 years later, Christians argue about it as something the world did, and it was us. We did Xmas. It was never offensive. It was never intended to take the Christ out of anything. It was about Christ. And I just don't think we're served by those kind of arguments. I mean, it's fun for us to argue about when, the fact that you would listen to Christmas music in July maybe or whatever, but I don't think it's very productive. I think far more pressing is the need for Christians to be intentional and to be focused, and to realize that there's a lot of distractions in this time that can not make that easy.
So let me ask you a question. When should Christians push back against the Christian worship and themes of this season being distilled into larger, more universal themes? This is, I think, one of the fundamental questions of Christmas. So we have this idea that exists in culture, that this language that Christmas is a season of good tidings for all, unity and peace. In fact, there's entire songs you wouldn't call Christian that essentially make the argument, Clint, that there should be peace in the world, people should behave well to one another, there should be generosity. These are, as I would see it, sort of distilled from a larger Christian gospel. The idea that the good news of Jesus Christ is for all, that Jesus' sacrifice is made for all, that should transform the lives of Christians so that they become people who become his hands and feet in the world. We would use the biblical language of the coming of the kingdom of God to describe this. But when we exist in a culture that has these Christmas songs and this sentiment that we should be good to all people, at what point does that become no longer religious in the Christian sense, but rather a kind of humanist sentiment? And that line is going to be tricky. It's going to be shifting. And in some cases, a Christian can make that statement and have that sentiment for a very Christ-centered reason. And another can say that to their neighbor because they just want to be a good person in the world and they don't have any particular religious beliefs. That's, I think, where we begin to find a really sort of difficult interpretive journey in Christmas. Where people get hung up, I think, is in trying to either sort Christmas into all of its different parts and try, well, this is faithful, but this isn't. A very kind of like compartmentalized, moralistic understanding of Christmas. And then you have the people who just say, hey, you know what? Carte blanche. Christmas is supposed to be about Christ, so I'm all in. The Santa Claus stuff and the elf that comes alive and all of the kind of extraneous celebrations that surround Christmas, right? The lighting of the Christmas tree, the Christmas concerts, the radio stations that have been playing sexualized songs for 11 months out of the year. Now they're singing songs about the manger and about Jesus. And what are we to make of all of that? I think fundamentally, for me, this will be a theme you'll see as we sort of dig down into some of these larger sections or genres of Christmas in our future conversations. I think the argument that I'm going to try to make is that these celebrations are helpful to the extent to which they prepare us and open our hearts to be willing to see Christ. And some of that is emotional. I mean, I will be 100% upfront about that. You put Christmas lights in your house, you play Christmas music, you're surrounded by your family. In some ways, you've produced a moment, if you're honest. But that moment isn't necessarily bad if it opens you and your heart to a willingness to see Jesus Christ as the center of it. What does it deliver you to? That's the question I think I would ask. And I think to the larger question that I began this section with, I would just say our culture lives in the moment in which it is seeking nothing more than an emotional experience, a goodwill, a universal good. But Christians need more than that. And so I hope whatever traditions we have, whatever things we allow into our celebration of this season, those things should deliver us to a higher end, a higher good, one that is centered in Christ. And to whatever extent that they detract from that, that's when I think we should offer a rather critical eye of them.
I think it's tough, Michael, because there are some wonderful things that happen during the Christmas season. I think, generally, if you talk to people and they were honest, I think they'd tell you that they often do feel a little better. There is an excitement. There is a little bit of camaraderie. There is a sort of goodwill for many people that comes with this season. Donations to soup kitchens and shelters and clothing ministries, all of those go up. People are, for a brief time, more aware and more conscious of helping others. The angel trees in every community. There is a sense of goodwill. I think for me, the danger is when those things become ends in themselves. In other words, when generosity or kindness or niceness or whatever becomes the goal rather than an expression of faithfulness. For the Christian, those things are all byproducts of following Jesus. I give to people who have needs because that's what Christ has called me to do. I seek to share of my own blessing with others because that's what it means to be faithful. Yes, that's a good thing, but the good is not the end in itself. The good is that it honors God through Christ when we do it. And for me, I think that danger is that lacking the kind of religious underpinning of Christmas, all the culture can offer is the emotion and the sort of good feelings that go with it. It's good to be nice. It's good to give money to people who don't have it. It's good to give gifts to kids who might not get them. Yes, all that's true. But why is it good? Is it good just because it makes me feel good and it's sort of better for everybody? Or is it good because it's anchored to what it means to be faithful to God through Jesus Christ, and it is my calling as a person who seeks to be Christian? Those are very different scenarios. They may look similar. They may have similar impact. In fact, sometimes people without the faith do more good than people of faith. But for me, it comes down to why do we do what we do? And I would say that in regard to just about every aspect of the Christmas holiday, I think.
Which I think is both laudable and where you find those moments where people do a double take and they look again. Because so much of Christmas, Clint, if we're honest, is not thoughtful. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean, to be honest, we celebrate Christmas for many different reasons. Let me give you an illustration of this and see if this tracks. Okay, let me ask you, what is the optimal weather for Christmas? I think most people would say snowing, or there's snow on the ground. I've heard this sentiment over and over, especially if you live in the north, right, where snow is possible. Where in the world would we get that idea biblically? I mean, nowhere, right? If we're honest, if we're intellectually consistent, that was not a reality wherever Jesus Christ was born. One of my favorite songs is White Christmas. And the part of that song that I think that engages for me is, of course, this idea of the white, clean, pure, sort of natural element, but also this idea, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas, surrounded by family, for me, intellectually, that does not square with a Christian observance of Christmas on any level. But it delivers me to a place where I value the gift of family. I value the gift and celebration of that thin sort of space. It incorporates more than just the intellect in that moment. Now, am I trying to make White Christmas sacred in any meaningful way? No. But I am trying to make the argument that I don't think that it is a roadblock to Christmas. I think it is a thing that Christians must deal with. We must be careful when a thing comes under the shroud of Christmas, and so then we accept it carte blanche. I don't think that's wise. I think we should be more reflective than that. I think we should be willing to ask some hard questions of Christmas and say, ooh, when has the song or when has the celebration or the tradition, when has it crossed the line and it's now accepted for me without any interpretation or really any question? Those are very difficult and I think important moments. And it doesn't look like us putting all of our beloved Christmas things on the table and dissecting them. I don't think it looks like killing Christmas so that we can figure out the part of it that's helpful. I think it's asking ourselves in a more fundamental, and I would even say spiritual way, to what extent are we worshiping and truly celebrating Christmas? And to what extent are we defensively or reflexively trying to walk a tradition or a habit or a practice that we've taken for granted? If we are willing to humbly put some of these things under a prayerful consideration, I think we might actually even learn more than what we might imagine before we start.
I think that's, again, one of the things that is so interesting about this season, Michael, is that if you trace, as you just pointed out, if we trace so many of our deeply held convictions, and if we trace so many of the things that are meaningful to us about Christmas, we'll find that virtually none of them go back to Jesus. Likely a man who in his lifetime never saw snow, right? I mean, very unlikely that Jesus encountered snow. Or the color red. We all know the color Christmas red belongs in every Christmas celebration. That happened in the 30s, thanks to the Coca-Cola company. Yes, there was some red in the holly, the ivy, the idea of red and green had a little bit of traction. But it's only in the last 100 years that the idea of Christmas red even existed. Before that, all colors were used in celebration of the holiday. It's not, that's a thing we did. And so many of our traditions are like that, that if you start to follow the threads, you realize they're not attached to the manger at all. They came from somewhere else. Now, is that in itself a problem? Not necessarily. Not really. Though I think we should be aware of it. What becomes a problem, I think, is that we defend those things as sacred rather than the thing they're supposed to point to. That we begin to get anchored to this peripheral stuff about the parts of Christmas we love, and that's what Christmas means, when in fact, the only reason those things are a part of Christmas was that at some point along the way, historically, someone thought they helped celebrate the birth of Christ in most instances. The closer you get to modern times, the less true that may be. But by and large, most of our traditions started because a group of people thought this helped us remember and celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. And I just think we have to be aware of that. In order to do justice, we have to treat the things as they are. You know, we're going to talk about music in an upcoming episode of this podcast, Christmas music. There's a lot to dig into there. I'm going to go hard on White Christmas when that time comes. So we'll leave that. But music is probably, music may be the place with the most good examples of secular and sacred mashed together. I think that for us is such a place, a thing of Christmas we love, that it's also maybe the easiest place to see how convoluted it gets at times.
So I think one of the really interesting facets of this conversation is how quickly people really do shut down in it. So, you know, I love Christmas. I love so many different parts of it. And yet I'm readily willing to admit that there's some parts of it that don't help. You know, they don't help me, I can say confidently, and I suspect that they don't help others. And, you know, I'll give an example of that. I think one of the beautiful blessings of Christmas is the tradition of gift giving. I remember as a kid, Christmas for me represented a kind of extravagance in the midst of a year, a truly exceptional day. There was no day that was even close to Christmas. And so it was special for that reason, and not just for selfish reasons. I mean, it was special because of the family who gathered there, because of the sacrifices that were made to make it possible. Christmas represented something truly deep and meaningful that remains true for me today. That said, I'm firmly and wholly willing to admit that the practice and tradition of gift giving is troublesome in a society that is as rampantly consumerist as ours is. The idea that things need purchased, and the latest and greatest needs purchased, and then in 5 years it needs, after it's consumed, to be thrown away. That's a troubling reality that we might have gotten from the gold, frankincense, and myrrh of the biblical story to iPhones and TVs and smartwatches and all of the kinds of things that dominate our attention today. And even that question, is the thing or things I purchased big enough or good enough? That's troubling. We should be troubled by that. Christmas should also critique some of the things that exist in our culture. And that's where it gets messy, Clint. That's where I think our roads intersect in a really, truly meaningful way. There isn't a particular orientation to Christmas, I think, that is right, that you can land on and say that this is theologically or morally required. I do think, though, one does need to have a posture of humility as it applies to Christmas. And that is why I do feel some level of distaste for the Christmas wars, is because I think they distract us from the important work of Christian celebration of Christmas, right? It's interesting. I've not heard anyone get up in arms about the Easter Bunny, who I find morally offensive, by the way. That's a different conversation. But, I mean, realistically, we should have some level of question, but we shouldn't let, I think, that war kind of mentality to circle the wagons, as I said before. We shouldn't let that become determinative, because then what that does is it keeps us from being reflective and relatively humble from the start, which is what we need to be to celebrate Christmas rightly.
Sort of a wonderful irony in the fact, Michael, that these references that you make to Christmas wars, the idea arguing that some things don't belong in Christmas or some things shouldn't change about Christmas,
right,
when our ancestors, by and large, argued that Christmas shouldn't be in the church,
right,
that we shouldn't have Christmas, that we shouldn't celebrate on that day, that we shouldn't give gifts like the pagans did, that we shouldn't bring a tree in the house, that it's so interesting how that history is sort of cycled. And now the very things that we defend as wholesome and religious and belonging to the tradition of Christmas were met with skepticism by our ancestors in the faith. Our fathers and mothers in the faith looked at those things very suspiciously. And I think that should give us a little bit of a relaxed nature. You know, you and I joke a lot about the elements of Christmas, but the reality is we should hold none of it too seriously, because none of it is in itself sacred. It is only a tool that can and should be used to point to Jesus. And if it doesn't do that, then we should recognize that and treat it accordingly. Not necessarily get rid of it, because that's not, we're never able to do that. But we should be able to acknowledge, yeah, this is something we need to hold on to fairly lightly, because as it turns out, it's not essential. The only thing essential for Christmas is that Jesus Christ was born, and that full stop. And that's really where the Gospels, I think, deliver us. Now, there are some great things that go with it, and in the coming weeks, we're going to dissect some of those. We're going to talk about where they come from, what parts of them we like and what parts of them we don't like, and that won't be in full agreement, I think. But we will, having laid this groundwork with some history, and some of this may have been repetitive, and we apologize for that, but I think we need to do this step before we can then go on to look at some of the things themselves.
Okay, so in future weeks, we're going to talk about Christmas and its traditions. We're not going to dissect it. We're not going to put it on the table and kill it so that we can break it apart. No, I see that. No, I can see two reasons why you should continue joining us. First of all, I think it's good to just have a moment where we get to lightheartedly talk about some of the things that we may have taken for granted, and to ask new questions about it, which I think is a kind of playful invitation that we find in any good Christian theology. I think the second is that in the midst of this season of celebration, it's good to just have a pause in a moment where we realize that it's not that serious. For all of the work that we put into what I'm going to call the perfect Christmas, that you don't need to reach some level which is not only unrealistic, but I would argue unbiblical. It's not scriptural. And so then you can, this is my frame, so then you can enjoy those things for what they are. Truly enjoy them. Hold them lightly. Let them be a joyous source of celebration and goodness. These conversations that we'll have are not going to just kill Christmas and make it no fun. I think it, at its best, will free you to the kind of celebration that you would like to have. And whether we can accomplish that or not, I don't know. But there'll be some laughs along the way.
Or you could decide you don't need this and get rid of it.
Yeah, there maybe if you're out there, put it in the comments. Thanks for being with us, friends. We look forward to seeing you for our next conversation, which will happen next week. We'll release next Thursday, and until then, we look forward to whatever that conversation might hold.
Thanks for listening.